My own training as a linguist, as a field linguist, was you drop me in the middle of the Amazon and I'd walk out a year later with a grammar under my arm. And part of the training is not to impose English categories into the grammar that you're describing. And the training in that, the understanding of the importance of that, came through centuries of hard work, really, of people doing that.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. This is the fifth and final episode in the Islam and the Bible series. The topic of this conversation that I had with Mark Durie is centered on the understanding of culture as it applies to, honestly, a whole host of things. But specifically, it starts out explaining the understanding of culture and linguistics of the originators of things like Muslim idiom translations. I think broadly, though, a thing that I started to realize that really started to get a sharper edge by the time I was having this conversation with Mark Durie was just how much of culture seems to be involved in religious belief and practice. While in the midst, because it was several months from recording the first interview with Aunt Greenham to recording the last interview with Mark Durie, in that time, I was in a history class and I kept coming back to Mark Knoll's thesis in America's God, where he talks about early colonial America kind of fashioned a new understanding of Christianity in entrepreneurial terms. And I started to see how maybe 20th, 21st century, 19th century Christianity, that they follow a similar line, that they are very affected by the culture around them, to the point that maybe these are cultural artifacts and that there's nothing wrong with that. And so much of the conversation in regard to Muslim idiom translations being driven by Nicene theology and the not translating Son of God directly into Arabic being one of the central issues here, I think it's important to look at what were the cultural roots of the people, the men who attended the Council of Nicaea. I think it's even more interesting when, as I'm recording this introduction here in late June of 2024, there's a controversy over potential leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention questioning how much they're willing to adopt the Nicene Creed. And I went into these conversations knowing I'm talking to evangelical Christians, and Nicene theology and the Nicene Creed are central to them. And I think every one of them has directly or indirectly so far affirmed that belief. And yet, here we are. There's a debate happening very publicly that this creed from the 4th century, one of the earliest creeds that Christians have, is called into question. And it's not being called into question by overly liberal, progressive people who want to change things. It's being called into question by people who, seem to be part of a revanchist movement within evangelical Christianity. I'm not saying that as indictment so much as I am. It seems like something from a British comedy. It seems like a comedy of errors kind of thing. I don't really have much more to say, so without further ado, here's my conversation with Mark Durie. Mark Durie, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be with you, Jared.
Thank you for being here. Before we get going, will you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm an Anglican pastor and no longer involved in parish ministry, but I have a PhD in linguistics and also one in a PhD in the theology of the Quran. For the last 20 or so years, I've been focusing, while also working in church ministry, I've been focusing on helping the church to understand Islam and to engage with it. And I'm particularly focused these days on the discipleship of Muslim background believers, helping people who turn to Christ to be really spiritually free in their journey. So that's my main focus. But I'm also really interested in how Western societies are responding to the challenge of Islam and Islamic radicalism, and I'm interested in the history of the church and how it has responded to the claims of Islam and how it's positioned Islam in terms of its worldview. So there are lots of different interests, even apart from Islam, but there's some of them. So it's good to be with you to talk about global mission and the influence of Islam as well.
Great.
I should say I teach Islamics and also spiritual warfare at Melbourne School of Theology, and I teach through Wesley Biblical Seminary in the US a course on discipleship of Muslim background believers through deliverance. In addition to the speaking and writing, I'm also teaching in a few different places.
Okay, fantastic. The subject of our conversation, or at least the jumping off point, is your chapter from the book Islam in the Bible, The Influence of Charles Kraft on Missions to Muslims. So this is the fifth, and I think the final. There's 20 contributors or 20 chapters and then an additional editor. And I didn't want to hunt down everybody, so I got five. I feel like that's a respectable number. So the fifth and final. So you're walking through Charles Kraft's career and you frame it in four phases, I think. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, that's correct. He was born in 1933, which would make him over 90 now. His first phase, which is more or less the 50s, was as a Brethren missionary in the northern part of Nigeria, which is a heavily Islamic area. His second phase was teaching African linguistics in the 60s. And then from 69 on, he was employed as a missiologist, primarily at Fuller, but he also taught at Biola. And that's the aspect of his work that I was particularly interested in that article. He was teaching a lot about the relationship between missions and culture. And then in the early 80s, he encountered the ministry of John Wimber and his famous workshop on signs and wonders that was conducted at Fuller. And his whole worldview was transformed. And from the early 80s on, Charles Kraft was involved in teaching and ministering in the areas of deliverance, healing, inner healing, and spiritual warfare. And he wrote a whole slew of books on that topic. So, yeah, 4 different careers. He's a fascinating and quite interesting person.
I guess so. The part that we want to dig into, the part that will we say he created the controversy that this book is addressing with the insider movements and the Muslim idiom translations, or is he just one of the creators?
It's hard to trace all the origins because insider-like ideas had been around for some time, but he really, I think he gave it a push. I think I would see him as the father of the insider movement intellectually, and his Fuller, from in the time that he was teaching there in the 70s, Fuller was really the preeminent school of global missions in the United States, and many missionaries went there to do masters or PhDs as part of their career, really. And so he was extraordinarily influential at that time. And it's interesting because although he didn't fully indicate his views on Islam in his classic book on culture and Christianity, in a series of lectures he gave in Marseille in the early 70s, he basically laid out the key insider ideas that you could be a Muslim and follow Christ, that you could reject Western Christianity, as he called it, but embrace a kind of Muslim Jesus following identity. He included at that time radical proposals to avoid terms like Father for God or not use Son of God for Jesus because it would be misunderstood. He said this was very much a piece with his book on Christianity and culture, but his lectures were particularly focused on Islam, and I think the key ideas of the insider movement, including some of the associated approaches to Bible translation, are all laid out there in Charles Kraft's 1972 lectures. And he later said that some of his students working in Muslim areas were using his textbook on Christianity and culture. They were using that as their manual for how to approach what became insider movements. Yes, I'd call him the father of the insider movement, and extraordinarily influential at that time.
So, because this is a podcast intended to have long form conversations about biblical texts, I think I would be remiss if I didn't spend some time talking about his philosophy or approach or understanding of biblical translation as it applies to the understanding of culture that you briefly touched on there. Can you explain how he? Not, and I know that it is not using father, son, that kind of language. Does it go farther than that with biblical translation?
Yes, he was very influenced by Eugene Nida, who was like a hero to him. And Eugene Nida had a particular understanding of meaning, language meaning, that Charles Kraft seemed to buy into. Eugene Nida, I would characterize, he was a linguist who was deeply shaped by mid-20th century American structuralism, which was strongly influenced by behaviorism and the view that meaning was a form of behavior, and tried to define linguistic meaning in terms of stimulus and response. So the meaning of an utterance of what someone said was their response to it. This whole approach, this understanding of meaning, really went out of fashion in the 60s. I would say Charles Kraft did his PhD towards the end of that period and in a structuralist environment under an American structuralist called Gleason. Now, the idea that the meaning of an utterance is how people respond to it is, I think, manifestly wrong. People could respond to something that's said in many different ways, depending on their circumstances. And to say that the meaning changes just because they respond differently to it, I think doesn't make much sense at all. But it was the view that influenced Nida, who became extraordinarily influential in the practice and theory of Bible translation. So Nida continued a mid-20th century view of linguistic meaning into the Bible translation space, and his influence continued for decades, well after that understanding of meaning had been abandoned. So an alternative understanding of meaning is that it's a cognitivist approach. That is, meaning is embodied in language because of through our cognition, that we mentally conceptualize things, and that you can analyze meaning in terms of how people conceive of the meanings of words, as opposed to the responses that they give. Now, Eugene Nida developed this idea called dynamic equivalence. That is, it's a confused idea, I think, but taking strictly in terms of his view of semantics, of the way meaning works. Dynamic equivalence was the idea that you could translate a phrase or a word by using an expression that didn't literally capture the meaning of what was said, but would have the same effect, the same response. So this is the behaviorism that sees human behavior in terms of stimulus and response. A dynamic equivalence translation would capture the response. And for example, you might have a culture that doesn't have lambs. So you have the seal of God instead of the lamb of God, for example. It might have the same response, or the piglet of God if you're in Papua New Guinea, where pigs are beloved and almost part of the family in some of the cultures. So he was suggesting a sort of radical approach to finding equivalence when you're translating the Bible. It became a confused idea because tied in with that, it was juxtaposed to overly literal, almost word-for-word translations of the Bible. But actually translating in language that people normally speak, that we call that idiomatic English, say, for example, if you're translating to English, using language in the way people normally speak is a somewhat separate issue from how to capture the particular meaning of a phrase. But they got tied up in this dynamic equivalence. And so a whole series of dynamic equivalence translations came out of Eugene Nida's teaching. So I think a good example is the Good News version of the Bible. But so somehow this idea of having an idiomatic kind of native sounding translation and a particular view of meaning were married together in this dynamic equivalence approach. And Charles Kraft, who was very aware that Muslims found the term Son of God offensive, and had also bought into Eugene Nida's understanding of meaning, even though I think by the 70s it was completely abandoned in linguistics, in scientific linguistics. He argued in his Marseille lectures of 1972 that when reaching Muslims, you shouldn't use the term Son of God at all. You just use Messiah instead, he said. And don't call God Father either. So he was basically jettisoning core theological concepts or terms that had been always recognized as part of Christianity. Up until then, no one would have suggested when you translate Son of God, you don't use the word Son. It would have seemed ridiculous to use another expression. But He said the meaning of an expression is the response that it evokes. And if Son of God evokes a negative response, as it does, because the Quran says it's blasphemy to call Jesus a Son of God, then you shouldn't use it because it's evoking the wrong response. But the problem is actually it's the meaning of Son of God that's offensive. And to essentially use a term with a different meaning to avoid that offense, I think is a complete misunderstanding of the concept of meaning. Anyway, that's a somewhat technical explanation. But Charles Kraft just bought into Eugene Nida's approach altogether, and he used it to be willing to throw out lots of aspects of what you might call core aspects of Christianity, Christian theology, in order to enculturate the act of following Christ.
On that, this is a thing that I've bumped on in this, and it's not really that I have a dog in the fight, but I do have this question, and I don't really feel like I've gotten a good answer. Essentially, do you think that every occurrence, and we'll just limit it to the New Testament, of the phrase Son of God is representative of Nicene or Trinitarian theology?
No, I don't.
Okay.
So let me explain my understanding of Son of God in the New Testament. Firstly, in the Old Testament, Son of God has a number of different meanings. So in Genesis, it refers to the sons of God who came and had children with humans. So there's references to certain spiritual beings of some kind. But the most important use of Son of God, for example, found in Psalm 89 and in Psalm 2, I think, is it was used in the context of covenant theology and covenant relationships, whereby a superior king would call an inferior ruler the son of God, his son, and he was understood to be in a son-like relationship. So the king of Israel was referred to as the Son of God. And you see it in the enthronement psalms where the king is referred to as God's son. So Psalm 2, I think, this is my son, today I have begotten you. So the enthronement ceremony was thought of as a begetting ceremony, as a kind of you've now become my son through this process. So obviously it's a metaphor. So that term, Son of God, which is used in a number of places to refer to divine sonship, that is the Messiah, the anointed one of God, becomes a synonym, in a sense, for Messiah. And that's clear in the Gospels, that sometimes Messiah and Son of God are used as equivalent in meaning, or very close in meaning. Not literally the same, but basically picking out the Messiah. When Jesus is being examined by the council, they say, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" So there's a number of references to Son of God in the Gospels that basically use it as an alternative for the Messiah. But something else happens in the Gospels, which is that the Son of God, the Messiah, is revealed to be divine. And it's particularly strong in John's Gospel and Jesus' references to his Father. But the term Son of God becomes ambiguous. It refers to Jewish expectations of the Messiah, but it also points to Jesus' eternal existence. And that in the prologue in John's Gospel, that Jesus is God from God, as the Creed says. The Nicene Creed, puts front and central the revelation that occurs in the Gospels, that the Son of God is not simply a reference to a human Messiah, which Jews at the time understood in terms of military resistance and overthrowing the Roman yoke and establishing a political kingdom. It's not just referring to that. Son of God is actually describing Jesus' relationship with the Father. And so the classic view of that relationship is that the term Son of God describes the eternal proceeding of the Son from the Father. That is, that the Nicene Creed's view is that Jesus comes from the Father, but it's not that he was created by the Father, or there was a time when he didn't exist, but that Son is the God-given term to describe his eternal relationship to the Father, that the Father is the source, and Jesus and the Holy Spirit come from that source, but that's not an event in time, it's an eternal relationship. So the metaphysics is complicated, hard to process, but I think what happened was the church said, how do we describe the relationship between the Father and Son? This is a mystery to us. He's not created the Son's not created by the Father, And they said, clearly the Father is primary in some sense. It's clear in the scriptures. So they said that the Son comes from the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. So that language is absolutely central to capture that relationship. And they chose a term, they used the term Son, which is in the New Testament, but it's also found it's a very accessible term in the languages of the world. There are some languages that don't have a word for son, and you could use child instead, like Indonesian, but it's a very accessible term. So, yes, so Son of God has different meanings in the New Testament, but it's absolutely clear that the trajectory of the Gospels is saying, yes, the Jews have thought of Son of God as a term for a human Messiah, but we see it now as a linchpin, as an explanation for the deity of Christ and central to our understanding of Christology, of the nature of Christ, that he is the Son of God. This is a God-given construct that helps us understand the relationship of the Father and the Son, which is, in a sense, beyond understanding. But there we are. We've been given this terminology to frame it for ourselves, and so we use it gladly because it's the language that God has given us to speak about himself.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how. So I think, okay, in the interest of playing devil's advocate, and I'm not trying to pick a fight, but Charles Kraft isn't here, and having not read what he wrote, but familiarizing myself from your article, it seems like what he bumps on with Nicene language and the theological propositions that come from the Council of Nicaea, that's happening within a cultural context. Correct? Is that is that what he's saying?
That's part of what he's saying. I think he was deeply suspicious of Western theology, of Christian theology. He wasn't particularly comfortable with the creeds, obviously, and he felt you could go back into the New Testament and, as an evangelical, just go with the Bible. But even that wasn't quite clear. Like, he's obviously rejecting some biblical categories when he rejected Son of God. But yes, he saw Nicene theology as a product of Greek culture, and he saw that as a very severe limitation. And it was therefore up to him or anybody to discard that. So he, in a sense, he was wise enough not to launch an attack on the Nicene Creed in public, but in a sense, he sidelined early Christian theology and its attempts to formulate a consensus on how to interpret the Bible, which is really what the Creed is. It's how to interpret the scriptures. So, yeah, he rejected that. And his arguments, his cultural arguments against the Nicene Creed, I think, were quite weak. He waved his hands and basically said it's Greek, so therefore we don't have to be bound by it. He was very embracing of different cultural takes on theology, and was willing to walk on the dark side a bit. He had a kind of anti-Western bias as well. This was these days you'd call it progressive, his worldview. So he was an early theological progressive in the sense that he was rejecting Western culture. And I think he'd been influenced by his experiences in the mission field, where he'd seen that missionaries, the Brethren mission that he was associated with, were imposing Western cultural values upon people for whom they were really inappropriate. And he extended that to all of the history of theology as well. And so he was able to dismiss the creeds, I think, because he just saw them as a cultural product. And different theologies, different cultures would create different theologies. He was very comfortable with that. He didn't seem to have any way of reconciling theological differences across cultures. He was just happy to swim in different currents and enjoy the difference. But he didn't provide criteria for truth. He was somewhat relativistic in the way he embraced potentially different theological perspectives. I think he saw missiology as a kind of superordinate discipline that could arbitrate between the different theologies. So like theology is here and missiology up there, and he was the missiologist. That's interesting. He was placing himself above theology. I've often wondered whether there were political conflicts going on in Fuller between the missiology department and the theology department. I know the theologians were somewhat uncomfortable with the missiologists, and I wondered whether that political struggle influenced the way he thought about theology as well. But he definitely had a dismissive attitude towards what he called Greek theology.
Are there, like, on the ground criticisms of cultural imposition that comes with theology that you would agree with, that you identify with?
Yes, I think so. Western theologies can be imposed inappropriately and can be quite damaging. And they're not always to do with history, with culture as much as with history sometimes. An example I'm really interested in is the Reformers' rejection of deliverance ministries. John Calvin and Martin Luther, as part of their cessationist worldview, rejected exorcism. And they were deeply influenced by that, by their dislike of the Catholic exorcists, the Roman exorcists that they encountered, and the showy performances they demonstrated. And there was a process of theologizing that meant that Western evangelical tradition has thrown out exorcism and deliverance, even though it's a core part of Jesus' ministry. So missionaries would go into Africa. I remember speaking to one missionary who said, not a missionary, sorry, an African Christian, a pastor. He said, I once mentioned the word witches to my father, and my father said, oh, there's no such thing as witches. And I asked my father, why do you say that? And my father said, oh, the missionaries taught us that. So the missiologist Hebert developed an idea that Western Christianity has what he calls a missing middle. He called it the floor of the missing middle, so that believe in God in his heaven and us down here on earth, but the area of witches and ghosts and demons and spells and incantations and all, that's just gone. And that is partly a result of historical processes, the way the Reformation worked out. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. It's also the effect of the Enlightenment, which is a cultural movement in Europe, which exalted the role of reason. So that, I think, the Enlightenment kind of cemented Western evangelical Christianity's dislike or rejection of the spiritual realm. And that has deeply impacted missions and crippled, I think, missions in numbers of areas. So it's complicated. There's I'd say, some historical mistakes, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's widespread, a deep cultural movement in the West, and those things together have caused a gap in Western Christianity that's been really damaging for missions. You could point to many other examples. It's controversial, but the treatment of women in theology is obviously deeply cultural and contested. And yeah, so another example is Western Christianity in its understanding, Western evangelical Christianity, particularly in its understanding of conversion, has focused on sin and forgiveness of sin as the core element of conversion. And it's downplayed rejection of evil and renunciation of relationships with evil. And so there's a kind of gap in Christian initiation that results from that. Instead of, say, in the early church, when someone came to Christ and was baptized, there was a process which included deliberate rejection of evil. And whereas now, if you look at, say, the prayers of commitment of organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, CRU now it's called, I think, or InterVarsity or the Billy Graham movement, you'll find that rejection of Satan or evil doesn't really figure in those sinners' prayers. So that's related to that earlier point. So yes, I completely agree that culture can influence theological orientations and it can be damaging. I don't see it as I don't think you should be so dismissive of the Nicene Creed. Just play this wild card of culture in order to throw it out the window. I don't think that makes sense. And I do believe that you can make core statements that are true in human language that are not just culture bound. I don't see that culture is as overwhelmingly determinative as Kraft said.
That may be the case. I'm not sure. I was trying to find an angle to get to. What I'm wondering is, if you're sitting across the table from someone who's going out to evangelize, which actually I want to stop for a moment. So even the word missionary, I spoke to this scholar, Jeremy Williams, and in his book, Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, there's a part where he talks about the word mission doesn't appear in use for evangelism until the late 17th century. I guess I bring that up to say the culture that we're in is like the water that we swim in, and it's so easy to not think about it. So if you were sitting across the table from someone, young person who's going out to evangelize, to a culture that is foreign to them, what is the bedrock that you would tell them? You can dig down to here, but this is where you need to stop. And anything that's above that, be willing to discard in the interest of evangelizing. Does I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. This is partly related or sometimes framed in terms of contextualization. To what extent do you contextualize? And Paul Hebert has written extensively about this, and I think his model is that a choice to cast something out, get rid of something, needs to be made in a particular way. It needs to be made by the community, not just by the missionary. And it needs to be made as a result of informed reflection and study of the scriptures. And there are a number of options. Like you might have there's aspects of a culture that need to be transformed. Sometimes they need to be replaced by something else, sometimes gotten rid of altogether. And the process works in two directions. So there's the question of how much of the existing culture should be brought into church life. And there's also the question of how much of the churchianity that you bring to the mission field should be kept and what should be interrogated and what is fundamental in terms of the scriptures. So I think everyone has to face those questions and decisions. And you can see the influence of missionaries when you visit, say, the buttocks in Sumatra and find that people are wearing suits to church, which is bizarre in an Indonesian context, which is tropical climate. And the churches are built that look like European churches, although somewhat changed. I think sometimes missionaries haven't been radical enough in setting aside culture or some cultural artifacts. But on the other hand, you need to combine cultural fearlessness to set aside things that are not essential with a strong conviction about what is fundamental. And if you don't have that balance worked out, you can get into a lot of trouble. And I think something, for example, I would say for me, the Nicene Creed is not up for negotiation. And that's a decision that many Christian denominations have come to. And one thing I want to say about that is when I was studying the church fathers around the time of the Nicene Creed, the Cappadocians, one thing was really obvious was that they were very well trained in Greek philosophy. And they were very suspect towards it. Like they did not buy into thoughtlessly into the culture of Greek philosophy. They were actually more aware of its dangers than we are. And they were very careful in the way they used philosophy or the tools of philosophy to answer theological questions. One of the objections of the Greek church, the Greek Orthodox tradition, of the West, of the Latinate tradition, is that, for example, Augustine was too influenced by Platonic philosophy. He wasn't equipped enough. He didn't actually read Greek. He wasn't aware of the dangers of following Greek philosophy. I think that's right, is that he wasn't fluent in Greek. And so the objection of the Greek church has been that the Western church has not been alert enough to the problems caused by importing Greek philosophy into theology. Aquinas followed Aristotle, and Augustine followed Plato. But so my impression of the Nicene Fathers, to say they would just play things of their culture or subjected to their culture and therefore can be swept aside, I think is really wrong. I think they were very thoughtful. And the Nicene Creed was an attempt by people who were sophisticated philosophically to find a formulation that was above all true to the scriptures. That was their main concern, was to accurately reflect what the scriptures taught. Now, to just sweep aside the Nicene Creed without actually going into all that history and trying to understand it properly and engage with it properly, I think is deeply problematic and arrogant, actually. It's very superior. I don't have to think about these things. I can just dismiss it because it's Greek. And I think it libels the Nicene Fathers. I think they were much more careful and thorough in the way they put that document together. Does it reflect some Greek cultural constructs? Yes, it does. But I think the authors of the Nicene Creed were aware of the dangers of that, and they were very careful the way they formulated it.
Have you interacted much with Orthodox or Eastern Christians on this issue of insider movements or Muslim idiom translations? Have you spoken with them much?
That's a great question, but I haven't interacted with them. Yeah. I can't imagine them abandoning Son of God, for example. But but that's just my imagination.
No,
So it would be an
that's
interesting it would be an interesting conversation to have.
I will try to wrangle one and who's who's embedded in that area. Yeah, and that's I've had two concerns going through the chapters in this book, and it's not that I have a beef with the Nicene Creed. I don't necessarily. I am concerned that there seems to be a lot of ontological conversation where in the biblical text there doesn't seem to be much concern for ontology, the substance of what Jesus was. I think there's a pretty interesting conversation around Trinitarian theology that's there in the biblical text. I'm only bringing this up because that does seem very Greek. Like, how do we answer this question? And then I wonder, like, why were you worried about that question? And I understand there was a conflict going on around that time. I know I haven't asked a question. I'm just thinking out loud. This is what I do. If you haven't listened to the podcast, I ramble until I figure out what I want to ask. Yeah, so that's more just me rambling than anything else. Sorry about that. Thoughts on that?
I think the concern for ontology, of course, is Greek. I believe that the statements in the Nicene Creed can be rendered in simple language in a way that's cross-linguistically translatable, even though some of the terms are like Almighty God. The word Almighty is quite difficult to translate, and Almighty is a bad translation, probably. But so there are terms there that require some unpacking, but I think it's a translatable set of concepts. Yeah, I'm comfortable with it. The problem with insider writing is that some of them have said, for example, Son of God just means Messiah. So let's just get rid of it and replace it with Messiah, which that completely undermines what I think is a really strong and absolutely central move in the Gospels and going into the epistles, which is the revelation that Jesus was God. And when they called him Son of God, they weren't just calling him the Messiah anymore. They were calling him the divine Messiah, and who stood in a relationship with God the Father in a way that a son is in relationship with a father. So it's very difficult to find any other language for that, because the idea of sonship is there's a relationship in a sense of cause and also of intimacy, of fellowship. That the son in a way comes from the father and is also with him, and intimacy. So the concepts that Son of God capture in the New Testament, and I think you can make this quite explicit and clear from exegeting the text, those concepts are really dependent on the idea of the metaphor of biological sonship. And to get rid of that language, to abandon that metaphor, I think undermines the shift from Messiah to divine figure. It's actually almost declares war on it in a way, and undermines the Trinity. I don't think the Trinity is just a Greek construct, which I think Charles Kraft implied. I think, I said that already, that the Nicene Fathers, their goal was to capture what the Scriptures said. They weren't trying to formulate a Greek theology. They were trying to say, what does the Bible mean? And they were doing it in the face of people that denied Jesus was God, denied the Holy Spirit was God. These are very basic questions that I think are translatable into different languages and contexts. And their attempt was to answer the question of what does the Bible say? And if you're going to reject the Nicene Creed, you need to go through all the many verses that they discussed and exegeted in their sermons, and the Nicene Fathers work on this, and actually come up with a theological framework for those resources to explain what it means to say that Jesus is God, or to answer the question of who is Jesus. And to dismiss it just because it's Greek, or just because it's formulated in Greek, on the assumption that these people were somehow so culturally bound and blind that all they could do was impose their culture on the Bible, that I think that's just complete misrepresentation of what the Greek fathers did. And the battle with the Greek fathers has to be a battle with their readings of Scripture. So that's where you'd need to engage. But usually the people that throw the creed out, they have no arguments. They have no reasoned analyses of what the Nicene Fathers were trying to express. They just sweep it aside as if they had the right to do that. I think that's not the right way to deal with Christian tradition. And I take the view that to do theology well, you need to engage with the tradition as well. You don't have to accept it all, of course. You can challenge it and critique it, but you can't just throw it out the window just because it's tradition. That's nonsense. You will be the victim of your own methodology if you do that.
If you hadn't already told me you were an Anglican, I would have guessed that you were an Anglican from saying that. I want to be able to ask this before we run out of time. Is there anything that, as you were preparing to sit down and talk to me today, you were like, I really hope Jared asks about this, that I didn't, because I follow every thought that comes across my brain and don't follow my notes?
It'd be interesting to talk a little bit about Christianity and Islam and the relationship between the two and what role that plays in Kraft's attempts to enculturate the gospel for Muslims. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's such an urgent political question, really. How should Christians construe Islam? Some weird views, which I think he got from some of the people that taught him. He saw Muhammad as a kind of Christ figure, someone trying to, or Paul figure, someone trying to express, to bring the news about God into the Arabs, almost a kind of Christian gone astray. And this was a view he collected from his someone who taught him, Bishop Kenneth Cragg, who thought that you could redeem Islam. From the very beginning, Christians have been struck by the amount of the Bible in the Quran, the amount of references to biblical figures, many references, Moses, Abraham, Ishmael, Jonah, and John the Baptist, Jesus, and so on. And it's been one of the puzzles. Why is there so much of the Bible in the Quran? And one of the early views, which has continued, is that Islam is a kind of Christian heresy. It's a form of Christianity that lost its way. And that influences how Christians look at Islam. They look at it through biblical and Christian spectacles, and they see Christianity in it. And they say, oh, this can be brought back. We can restore Islam to its Christian origins. And that view has been very widely spread. When John of Damascus, in his book on heresies, listed Islam as a heresy, in a way he was saying Islam is Christianity lost its way. So it's like there's a kind of familial relationship between Islam and Christianity. And those people in the Insider movement generally have a more kind of positive view of Islam. That is, you can restore Islam to its Christian roots. And Charles Kraft definitely was along that line. And he viewed that he felt that you could have an authentically culturally Muslim church that was nevertheless sound, that in its worship of God and its understanding of Jesus, but which jettisoned any bits of Christianity that was somehow incompatible with Muslim culture. The problem is that the Quran is fundamentally anti-Christian in many ways, and one of its ways is that it emphatically rejects the idea that God could have a son, and more generally that God could be relational with human beings, which is integral to the idea of the Trinity. And to try and construct a Muslim Christianity, as Kraft would have called it, or communities of Muslim followers of Jesus, as a later generation would have said, to construct that while also remaining true to certain Islamic antipathies, the deep hostility to the idea of Son of God. To do that, I think, was based on a misreading of Islam, a sort of this Christian view of Islam. I love the idea, when we look at things, we often think we're tracing the shape of the thing we're looking at, but we're just tracing the shape of the frame that we're looking through. Wittgenstein said this. He was speaking about mathematics, but I think it's more true. He said, we think we're tracing over and over again the shape of the world, but we're just tracing the shape of the window that we're looking through. The world is rectangular because the window is rectangular. And Christians have often viewed Islam through a Christian lens, and they've seen Christianity. And I think that was a fundamental mistake, that Kraft was influenced by Kenneth Cragg, who taught him Islamics first. So that goes back 1400 years, and that struggle to how to understand Islam is one of the key kind of ingredients in this devil's brew of ideas that we're trying to make sense of.
Thank you for bringing that up. That reminded me. So you say that he describes Islam as a culture, and my takeaway is that somehow Christianity is transcendent of culture. Is that a good understanding of what he thought?
No, I think Kraft saw Christianity, Western Christianity, as very culturally embedded, but he believed in that there was something that was transcendent of culture in the Gospels. He wouldn't have called it necessarily Christianity, or the use of the word Christianity was a bit ambiguous. So sometimes he used it to refer to that core, and sometimes he used it to refer to the cultural things that he was wanting to discard. Later, the insiders used Christianity as just referring to the culture that could be discarded. So they abandoned the term Christianity. So Kraft was speaking about Muslim Christians, but his students saw the inconsistency of that, and they got rid of the idea of Christian altogether. They said the concept of Christian and Christianity is just cultural. But Kraft, if you consider his claims seriously, that he said every culture is ripe for Christianity, that all cultures are equal in terms of their readiness for Christ. So you can bed the truth about Jesus or relationship with God through Christ into any culture. That does presuppose that there's a universal core, a kind of cross-cultural core of Christianity. But a fundamental problem with Kraft's whole approach is he had no way, theoretically or practically, of defining that. Because he saw everything as so bound in culture, he had no way of escaping culture. And he had no methodology for actually defining theology in cross-cultural terms. So he was swimming in a sea with no foundation. You could never put your foot to the ground and keep your head above water. So that's a fundamental problem with his approach, a conceptual problem, philosophical problem, if you like, that he implied that there was a core Christianity because of the benefits of knowing Christ or the benefits of following God through Christ. But he had no way of articulating that because every articulation would be culture bound. So I think that's a fundamental weakness in his whole worldview. And you've got I think those that have followed him have a similar problem. Like, how can they define the essential elements of the faith of the New Testament, which is not culturally bound, and how to do that? If you regard theology as subservient, Kraft saw theology as being under culture, the study of culture. Theology was a part of culture, and culture was dominant over theology. But he had no way of escaping that. I think that's a fundamental problem. There's no way of achieving a consensus about what following Christ meant, because every consensus would be culturally bound. So you couldn't escape that kind of that mess, that whirlpool. You're always just being circled. You couldn't get out of it.
I think that being from Texas, as I am, if I tried to have a conversation with you about football, and if I'd never been outside of Texas, it would take me some time before I realized that you and I were not discussing the same game. And there's a certain amount of self-awareness that I would have to develop to leave that conversation and say, oh, over in Australia, they call football, like they're talking about something else when they talk about football. And that's a pretty superficial example, because I also have a TV and the internet. So I do know that pretty much everyone else in the world calls what I call soccer football, but it's still something that I have to develop and cultivate from the culture that I live in. So I guess what I'm saying is I can appreciate there's just all these little things that follow you around, and you just do them and you participate in them and you're a part of them. And how do you separate yourself from it's the water that you swim in? Like fish probably don't ever think about water. So how much can I actually think about my culture?
That's a great question. And it's a question that anthropologists and linguists face. My own training as a linguist, as a field linguist, was you drop me in the middle of the Amazon and I'd walk out a year later with a grammar under my arm. And part of the training is not to impose English categories into the grammar that you're describing. And the training in that, the understanding of the importance of that, came through centuries of hard work, really, of people doing that very thing and realizing the errors that could happen when you use, say, Latin grammatical categories in other languages. And a lot of the struggle in linguistics has been to find a universal framework for understanding grammar, for example, that could be applicable to any language in the world. And I think a lot of progress has been made in that. There are processes that you can go through to try and rescue yourself from the trap of your own worldview, listening carefully, stepping outside the frame, learning to think critically. One of the big problems is meta-language. Like, in the end, what terminology you're going to use that's cross-linguistic and universal. I really like the approach, the semantic primitives approach of a Polish-Australian linguist who argues that every language has a set of 70 or 80 basic words that have basic meanings that can't be explained, but are available in all languages. So this is the idea that every language shares common concepts, a small number of them, and that you can define more complex concepts in terms of these simpler concepts. In her view, human beings do share a fundamental cognitive similarity. We share basic meanings. And cultural meanings are more complex. They're built out of those basic meanings, but we can analyze them in ways that every language would comprehend and understand. So we have a common human cognition, which is expressed in language. But when you look at, say, the details of culture, there's enormous diversity. So she's argued, for example, that emotion terms are not generally translatable. A good example is in Persian, in the Farsi language, there's no word that really captures the word love in the New Testament, agape. There's no easy word to translate that. And when you preach to Iranians about the love of God, you have to explain that this is not a concept that they have a word for in their language. They have a word for lust or sexual desire. They have a word for compassion. There are words that are related, but not every language has a word that means happiness. In fact, happiness is a really difficult word to translate. So I think you can be trained to be more self-aware. You can be trained to explicate meanings, to make distinctions, to understand. It's a skill, but I don't think it's an impossible task. I'm not a complete relativist. I don't think that different cultures are completely inaccessible to each other. I think you can use basic concepts to explicate differences between languages and to explain, for example, that freedom doesn't mean the same thing as liberté in French, that they have differences. Those cultural differences are really important, but they can be explicated. Yeah, so I'm an optimist based in terms of, I don't think it's a hopeless task to find a kind of ground. But if you're completely naive and you've never been exposed to cultural difference, you will make the mistake of thinking that everybody thinks like you. A good example, which Anna Wyzbicka has used in her writing, is that psychologists have proposed a small number of basic emotions that all human beings have. I don't know, anger, for example. But actually, a lot of the terms that the psychologists work on as their universals are actually untranslatable in many languages, that languages don't necessarily have words for that particular, meaning that particular emotion. Is emotion universal? Yes, it is. Is the way that it's described or framed in cultures universal? No, that varies. Can those differences be explicated and explained in ways that are understood across languages? Yes, I think they can, but it's complex. So one of the things about Charles Kraft is he never really engaged with this issue about how to find a foundation for a non-cultural theology, and he just lacked. His whole theory of semantics made it impossible for him to do that, I think, because that behaviorist view that the meaning of an utterance is the response it evokes is just hopeless in terms of a tool for understanding how language works.
You made the point in your chapter that a lot changed at the same time that he was doing his graduate work and doctoral work with Chomsky in particular. And a lot has changed I'm no expert, but a lot has changed since he did his work, even back then.
Yes, and it was interesting to me that Charles Kraft was working in linguistics in the 60s, but the linguistics he was working with was passing away. It already passed away. And I sometimes wondered how he responded to the Chomskyan revolution of the 60s, and because he was so much a product of the mid-20th century structuralism. He couldn't have continued for long in linguistics, I think. It would have been difficult. You had to really get with the issues that were being explored at that time or disappear, really, because linguistics had just shifted so radically, turned on a dime, went in a completely more cognitivist direction. Yeah, it's only within the kind of area of Bible translation that those behaviorist concepts continue to be influential. through Eugene Nida's work. One of the questions you haven't asked me is, what is Hebrew or Greek culture God created? But you have a few questions there that we haven't covered.
Oh, yeah, like I told you, I go off the reservation. Once you start talking, look, I know you have other things to get to. If you want to come back later, I can try to do a better job of asking all the questions. But
Doing
that's,
fine.
what's that?
You're doing fine.
I do want to find out, what would you have the listeners read or YouTube to check out or podcasts to listen to? Just where would you send people to get a better understanding of what you're discussing in this article, or just anything that you think people should know more about?
That's really difficult, because one of the things I came to in looking at Charles Kraft is I realized that there was an intersecting set of ideas in several different domains. One was his attitude to theology, his attitude to Western culture, his view about the relationship between culture and theology, his understanding of meaning, and all these different influences, his take on Islam, how he saw Islam. All these different influences, each one of them is quite conceptually difficult to wrestle with if you've never wrestled with it. Like, it's actually tricky to understand how Christians have seen Islam, because you need to understand it in its own terms fully to grasp what Christians do when they think of it as a kind of as a cultural, as a heresy of Christianity. You need to understand what it actually is in order to understand the mistakes that are made when people see it as a form of Christianity. And also the rejection of Greek theology. You need to really get into that. You need to read the Greek fathers and understand what they said and how they thought and what they were trying to do. And it's not simple. So one of the things I found challenging in terms of uncraft and explaining the complexity of the mistakes that were made by him and by his students is that there were a number of different things that all came together. And in order to wrestle with those things, you need to jump out of your worldview and understand those different movements and currents. If I say the behaviorist view of meaning as a response to that's evoked to a stimulus, what does that even mean? That requires some thinking. What is meaning if it's not a response? And how do we formulate them? How do we describe meanings of words? This is not a simple. It's not a simple thing. But somehow all these different kind of aspects of Charles Kraft are deeply embedded and intertwined with culture in different ways as well. And I can certainly see the appeal of Kraft at a particular time in history to certain people of with a distrust of Western civilization, and they'd been shaped by certain influences. But to really grasp the enormity of the mistakes that he made, you need to engage in many different areas. Now, I find it quite difficult to recommend to people where to go with that. You could read his book on Christianity and culture, but some of that just seems wrong to me. Like he makes assumptions that are incorrect. And it's very difficult to challenge someone's unspoken assumptions, to get behind what they're saying and get to the root of their assumptions. So, yeah, I wish it was easier for me to explain those problems. There's the website Biblical Missiology, which has a whole series of challenges to the Kraftian inheritance, including the problem of Muslim idiom Bible translations and some of the other decisions. So there's that. There's a number of books that have been written about insider movements, both for and against, and you can read through that. And those books, that one, The Islam and the Bible, is just one of a whole series. People need to find their way through that. These issues of insider movement ideology, including the Muslim idiom translations, which are a somewhat distinct but related issue, these issues are not gone away. There's still divisions in the evangelical community in the United States, and particularly, but elsewhere as well. And they're continuing to rumble around. And I think it's still a difficult environment with a lot of conflict and disagreements. But everyone, I think, needs to try and inform themselves as best they can. For myself, I just encourage people to read widely and to be exposed to different perspectives and wrestle with the ideas that are presented there. It's not always easy to find your way through those arguments, but it's very necessary to engage with them.
Okay. Last question. What do you read for fun?
That's a good question. Sometimes I've been reading novels by the Canadian Catholic artist and novelist Michael O'Brien. which I really enjoy. And I think he's one of the greats of the last 50 years. At the moment, I'm reading Tale of Two Cities by Dickens and marveling at his command of language, which was quite extraordinary. So I'm trying to ground myself there. Recently rereading The Brothers Karamazov, and again amazed at his anticipation of the ideological and theological issues that have plagued the Western world in the centuries since he wrote. But yeah, variety of different things. Sometimes I read Quranic scholarship, the origins of Islam, and that's another thing that interests me as well. There's a lot of findings of inscriptions and Arabic materials that are cropping up all the time in the Middle East. That this is a very fertile and fascinating area of study, the origins of the Quran and the Islamic community. So that also interests me. That's fun, actually, for me to read about those things.
If you enjoy it.
I do.
Is there any Australian fiction that you would recommend that I check out? You're my
I
first
haven't.
Aussie, so I would be remiss if I did not ask that.
I think perhaps the greatest is Patrick White. I'm not sure which one of his books. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He'd be worth looking at. But I haven't read a lot of Australian fiction, although there's some wonderful authors out there. But yeah, he's probably recommend Patrick White to you.
Okay.
I'm very involved in my world of writing and ideas, so I wish I had more time for reading literature and stepping out of the daily battle of ideas and writing about Islam and related issues. I need more separation sometimes from all that stuff.
That's your call. If you're enjoying yourself, stay the course. Okay, unless you have anything else for me, I'm going to call this one good.
Okay, Jared. Good on you, mate. Thanks.
Mark Durie. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. That concludes, at least for the time being, the series on Islam and the Bible. Next week, we're jumping into Hebrew Bible with Gavin Fernandez, and we'll be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article titled Returning the King and the Women to the Beginning of the Song of Songs. So here's a quick preview of that episode. Enjoy and take care.
Posed to her by these women. So coming back to your question, these women which crop up throughout the song, they are very important. They're not just celebrating the fact that the king in the opening verses is bringing his bride to, well, I would say bride, I would argue the bride, but it's not so apparent in the first few